Texas Hill Country, April 1870. For the morning sun had barely crested the limestone ridges when Xavier Granger caught the distant glint of smoke curling where it should not have been. He reined in his gelding, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his dusted hat. The scent reaching him was wrong meat and ash, but nothing fresh, nothing tended. He had been riding since dawn, delivering a wagon load of feed to a widow 2 valleys over. But now something in his gut told him to veer off course. He nudged the horse off the main trail, guiding it through dry brush and up toward the abandoned homestead that had once belonged to the McMillan family. They had pulled stakes 2 years back after the fever took their youngest. No one had lived there since, far as he knew, but someone had been there recently. He dismounted behind the barn, drawing his revolver as he crept past the sagging fence. The yard was silent except for the low groan of wind through bare trees. The main house stood hollow and still, but the smoke was coming from the small stone smokehouse tucked near the back. He approached slowly, boots crunching on gravel. The door was shut tight, barred from the outside. As he got closer, he heard it movement. A scrape, then a soft thud, then a voice, hoarse and dry. "Is someone there?" "A woman." Xavier yanked the door open. Inside, crouched in the dim glow of smoke-filtered sunlight, was a young woman, her dress torn at the shoulder, dirt smudged across her cheek, hair matted with sweat. She blinked up at him, eyes wide with disbelief. "I was not expecting anyone to save me," she said, voice raw like she had not spoken in days. He stared at her for a beat, then holstered his gun. "Well, lucky for you. I do not much like leaving folks locked in smokehouses." She staggered toward him, and he caught her before she could fall. She was too light, her skin warm with fever. "Come on," he said, lifting her into his arms. "Let's get you out of here." He carried her to his horse, wrapped her in his duster, and rode hard toward his cabin nestled 10 miles east. She barely spoke the whole way, her head against his chest, breath shallow. All she managed to whisper before sleep took her was her name. Brielle Zanders. His jaw tightened. Whoever had done this to her had not just scared her, they had broken something. By the time they reached his cabin, the evening sun was bleeding into the hills, and Brielle burned with fever. He laid her on his cot, soaked a cloth, and dabbed her forehead. She flinched at first, then let herself rest. Xavier sat beside her, watching the rise and fall of her chest, the way her hands curled like she was still bracing for something. He had seen wounded before soldiers, drifters, folks caught in crossfire. But she was different. There was something in her still fighting. When she woke the next morning, she looked around the cabin, eyes slow to adjust. "You are safe now," he said gently, handing her a tin cup of water. "No one's coming for you here." She drank, hands trembling. "Where am I?" "My place. East of Llano." He hesitated. "You were locked in that smokehouse. You remember how that happened?" Brielle looked away. "I came west with my uncle to start over. He sold me to a man for 6 horses and a bag of flour. The man kept me tied for 2 weeks. When I tried to run, he threw me in there, said I would come out when I learned to behave." Xavier's stomach twisted. He had seen men do bad things, but this was something else. "He's still out there?" She nodded. "His name's Clyde Minton. He's got a place up near the river bend. Figures I am still there. He thinks I will not make it far." Xavier stood slowly. "You are not going back." Brielle looked up at him, startled. "You do not even know me." "I know enough." She stared at him for a long moment, then lowered her eyes. "You are the first person who ever came back." Xavier did not say anything. He pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders and set about making broth. The next few days passed quiet. Brielle slept often, gaining strength. By the 4th morning, she was able to walk to the porch. She leaned on the railing, eyes tracing the hills. "I did not think I would ever see sky again," she said softly. Xavier handed her a mug of coffee. "You are free now." She looked at him. "Are you always this steady?" He gave a faint smile. "Only when I know someone needs it." They shared silence, the kind that did not press for more. That night, thunder rolled in the distance, and Brielle startled awake. Xavier was already at the door, rifle in hand. "It is just the storm," he said, seeing her fear. She stood in the doorway, arms wrapped tight around herself. "He used to come during storms. Said I would not scream loud enough for anyone to hear." Xavier crossed the room slowly and placed his hand over hers. "You never have to see him again. I promise." Brielle looked at him, eyes shining. Why do you care? He paused. Because I know what it is to feel alone, and I know what it is to be found. That night, she did not sleep in his bed alone. She curled beside him, his arm around her shoulders, and for the first time in too long, she felt safe. In the days that followed, Brielle began to help around the cabin. She gathered herbs, mended shirts, even laughed once when Xavier burned a pan of cornbread. They moved around each other easy, like the space had always been meant for two. One morning, she stepped outside and found him chopping wood. He looked up when he heard her. You are healing. Brielle nodded. Thanks to you. He set the axe down and walked over. I want you to stay, Brielle. She searched his face. You do not even know what I carry. I do not need to. You are here. That is enough. She reached up, touched the side of his face. You saved me. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. You saved yourself. I just opened the door. And in that quiet moment under the wide Texas sky, something settled between them. Something real. Neither of them said the word, not yet. But it was there, steady and sure and waiting. The wind shifted on a Thursday afternoon, warm and restless, pushing the scent of mesquite through the dry grass surrounding the cabin. Brielle stood beneath the lean-to, sleeves rolled just past her elbows, fingers stained dark with berry juice from the wild dewberries she'd found along the creek. She'd gone farther than usual, drawn by the hush of the trees and the rhythm of her own breath, but never once felt fear pressing behind her ribs the way it used to. Xavier returned not long after, saddle creaking beneath him as he eased down from his horse. There was dust at his collarbone and a fresh scrape along his knuckles. I stopped by the Truett place, he said, lifting the basket from her hands. They've been hearing things. Hooves after dark, too many for cattle. Brielle set a pot of water on the stove, nodding once. You think it's him? I think it's someone who knows how to move quiet. She didn't ask more. The walls of the cabin felt thinner when names were spoken aloud. Instead, she pulled a clean cloth from the drawer and reached for his hand. I'd rather not see that bleed into your supper, she said, dabbing the scrape. Xavier watched her, still as a man listening for thunder. You've steadied quicker than I expected. She looked up then, cloth paused mid-motion. I've had to learn how to stand up fast, even when I'm shaking. He shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. That kind of learning doesn't come without cost. I know. She folded the cloth, set it aside. But I'm not afraid of the cost anymore. I'm more afraid of staying small. That night, Xavier laid 2 rifles across the table and began checking the sights. Brielle watched from the hearth, the flicker of firelight catching the line of his jaw. She had never thought much about safety before, not in the way he offered it. It wasn't just in the strength of his hands or the steadiness of his voice. It was in the way he listened, even when she didn't speak. Do you always watch the door when it gets quiet? She asked. I listen more than I watch. And what do you hear now? He lifted his gaze from the rifle. A woman finding her way back to herself. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fire cracked behind her, and outside, a coyote yipped somewhere down the draw. Then she crossed to the window and pulled the curtain back with 2 fingers. I can ride, she said. I've done it before. You planning to leave? She turned to face him. No, I'm saying you don't have to keep me hidden behind these walls. If he's near, I want to be part of what sees him gone. He leaned back in the chair, studying her. You know what it would mean if he found you. I know what it means if I keep waiting for him to show up. He didn't argue. Instead, he handed her a rifle. They spent the next morning out by the tree line, where the ground was softer and the brush broke wide. Xavier set up bottles atop a split log and showed her how to breathe steady, how to let the weight of the rifle settle into her shoulder. Her aim was wild at first, too tight in the wrists, but she listened. Each shot steadied her more than the last. You're holding too much in your chest, he murmured, standing behind her. Let the breath fall low. She tried again. This time, the bottle shattered. A slow smile touched her lips. I never knew I could do that. He met her eyes. You can do more than you know. As the sun slanted west, they rode out together, not far, just enough to scout the ridge facing the river bend. She remembered the bend from when she first arrived, how the water curved like a question mark through the rocks. Now, she saw it differently. Less like a place of fear, more like a mark she could reclaim. They dismounted on the rise, horses tied to a scraggly juniper. Xavier crouched low, scanning the valley with a spyglass. Smoke, he muttered. South of the bend. Too narrow for a campfire. Brielle crouched beside him. He's laying low. Likely, but he's not far. They rode back in silence, the sky a wash of lavender and rust. At the cabin, Xavier stripped his gear and lit the lantern. Brielle set out a loaf she'd baked that morning, still warm enough to split with her hands. Will you go after him? She asked. I will not go alone. She met his gaze, steady as her hands. Then we'll go together. Later, as they settled into sleep, Xavier reached across the small space between their beds and brushed his thumb along her palm. You don't have to be brave every second. She exhaled, a sound between breath and release. I know, but I want to be. His fingers curled gently around hers. The storm wasn't yet over, but the fear no longer owned her. Not with him beside her. Not with her rifle clean and her feet planted firm in soil she now claimed as her own. The following morning brought a hush to the land, the kind that settled before something broke loose. A pale mist clung low over the grass, thick enough to blur the distant bluff where the cedars grew in clusters. Brielle stood near the corral, hands tucked beneath her shawl, watching Xavier saddle the buckskin with quiet focus. She hadn't spoken yet, not since they'd risen, but he didn't press her. She'd slept little, the stiffness in her shoulders saying more than words. He adjusted the cinch and leaned his weight into the leather. We'll ride west, circle around, and come down from above the bend. Brielle nodded once, eyes steady on the horizon. If he's got anyone with him, they'll be watching the crossing. Better to come through the canyon's mouth. Xavier paused, then gave a single, approving nod. You read him right. He passed her the smaller rifle. Keep it close, but not tight. You'll move faster if you aren't fighting it. They rode out just past first light, keeping to the brush where the terrain rose in waves of stone and sparse oak. The buckskin trod sure-footed, and Brielle's mare, lean and quick, kept pace without complaint. Neither of them spoke much, the silence between them companionable, not strained. The land seemed to hold its breath. By midday, they'd reached the rim above the river bend. The water wound far below, sluggish and thick with spring runoff. Brielle crouched behind a limestone outcrop, peering through the field glass Xavier handed her. There, she said, voice low. Canvas tent. 2 horses. 1 man at the fire. Looks like he's cleaning a rifle. Xavier took the glass, adjusted it. That's him. Brielle pulled her shawl tighter. He's older than I remember. Thinner. Men like him burn up fast. They waited another hour, watching movement. No others showed. Just Clyde, restless and pacing, like a man expecting a knock. Xavier pointed toward the draw south of the camp. We'll come through there. You take the left tree line. I'll keep to the bluff and come down once you're in position. Brielle didn't hesitate. I can do it. Xavier laid a hand on her shoulder, firm and brief. I know. She moved swift and low, weaving through scrub and rock, her boots silent on the soft dirt. When she reached the trees, she crouched and steadied her breath. Xavier's shape moved above, nearly indistinct in his stillness. Clyde was seated now, back to the fire, cleaning the same rifle for the 3rd time. The nervous twitch in his jaw hadn't changed. Some part of Brielle's chest pinched, unexpected and sharp. Not pity, something else. A hollow feeling, like looking at a wound long past healing. Xavier called out, voice sharp as cracked ice. Step away from the fire. Clyde froze, then rose slow, turning with the rifle still in hand. He didn't lift it. Not yet. Thought you were dead, he said, eyes flicking past Xavier toward the trees. Brielle stepped out, rifle raised. You should have hoped I was. His eyes landed on her, and something in his face curdled. You ain't meant to speak to me. Xavier stepped closer. She don't answer to you anymore. Clyde's lip curled. She's mine. No, Brielle said, her voice clear. You sold your claim when you left me to rot in a box like an animal. A long silence stretched. Then Clyde's fingers twitched toward the trigger. The crack of Xavier's rifle split the air. The bullet struck the dirt at Clyde's feet. Next one doesn't miss, Xavier said. Clyde's chest heaved, but he dropped his rifle. What now? You gonna hang me? No, Brielle said, stepping forward. You're gonna walk. You'll head south and keep walking until your boots fall apart. You come near me again, I won't miss. Xavier didn't look at her. He watched Clyde. You understand her? Clyde's face twisted into something bitter, but he nodded. You're both fools. He left on foot, rifle still buried in the dirt, pack unopened. Brielle didn't watch him go. She turned and walked back toward the horses. Xavier caught up to her near the bluff. You sure? She rested a hand on the mare's neck. Killing him wouldn't change what he did, but letting him know I'm not the same girl? That's worth something. He nodded once, quiet. They rode home slow, the sun arching behind them. The air felt lighter, the silence easier. At the cabin, she washed her hands in the basin, the water turning faintly red with dust and sweat. Xavier set a kettle on the stove, then leaned against the wall, watching her. You didn't hesitate, he said. I was waiting a long time to stop running, she replied, drying her hands. He crossed the room, close but not crowding. You're not the same woman I found in that smokehouse. No, she said gently. But you were the first one who saw past what was broken. He reached for her hand, rough fingers lacing with hers. You're whole now. You did that. She looked up at him, something soft and unguarded in her face. I want to stay, Xavier. Not just because I'm safe here, but because I feel more myself beside you than I ever did alone. He didn't speak right away. He just leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers, the same way he had that first night she let herself rest. Then stay, he whispered. And let's build something worth keeping. And she did. The garden rose lay damp under the morning's first warmth, and Brielle stooped to pull early weeds from between the onion shoots. Her skirt brushed the soil, the hems faded from sun and use. She moved with the quiet rhythm of someone no longer watching over her shoulder. Across the yard, Xavier split fence rails with steady swings, not in a rush, just working through the kind of task that kept a man grounded. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over, brushing back a strand of hair that had loosened from her braid. You've been meaning to fix that south post since I got here, she said, eyeing the plank tucked under his arm. He set it down and looked at her, a hint of surprise in his pause. I suppose I have. You always wait this long with things that need mending? I used to, he said. Now I find I'd rather keep the place from falling apart. They stood in that easy silence, the kind that felt earned. Then Brielle glanced toward the ridge. I've been thinking, she said, her voice light but certain, about building something of my own. Not away from here, just something that belongs to me. Xavier rested one hand on the fence and leaned into it slightly. What did you have in mind? A still room, she said. For tinctures, salves. I know the plants around here now. I've been gathering more than I can use. His brow lifted just a little. You want to sell them? I want to be useful, she said. Not just to you, but to the ones nearby. I'm not the only one who's been through hard things. He nodded once. I can help you raise the beams. I'd like that, she said, and smiled, not the kind that came from relief, but one that rose from plans. That afternoon, they rode to the McAllister place to barter for timber. The trail was dry and straight, the wind carrying the scent of cedar and warmed stone. Brielle rode without clutching the reins tight, her seat more confident than it had been weeks ago. She wore her father's old work gloves, passed to her by a neighbor woman who'd once traded them for a jar of honey and a clean shirt. At McAllister's, she bartered 3 jars of pickled beets and a bundle of dried yarrow for the lumber he had leaned against the back of his wagon. He didn't question her price. Folks in the region had started to notice the change in her, how she met their eyes, how she didn't flinch at raised voices or sudden movement. On the way back, she turned in the saddle. I was thinking of painting the door green. Xavier glanced over. Any reason? It's the color of growing things, she said. Seems right. He nodded. You ought to have what feels right. They spent the next week raising beams. Xavier handled the heavy lifting, but Brielle cut every joint herself with a borrowed saw, shoulders aching by evening. He didn't take the work from her hands, only steadied the ladder when she climbed and handed her nails without needing to be asked. On the 5th day, the still room stood roofed and dry, tucked beside the edge of the barn where morning light would warm it earliest. She swept out the sawdust, then leaned in the doorway, hands on her hips, breath catching in her chest. Feels real now, she said. Xavier stepped up beside her. It is real. You made it that way. She turned toward him. I used to think I didn't deserve something lasting. You were wrong. I know that now, she said, and her voice caught, not from sorrow but from the strange joy that comes when fear finally lets go. He stepped closer. I've been thinking too. She tipped her head, curious. If you're building something here, he said, then I'd like to build it with you. Not just the room. I mean the rest of it. Days, seasons, whatever we've got coming. She didn't say anything at first. Just reached out, touched the edge of his collar where the fabric had frayed. Her hand stayed there. What would that look like to you? She asked. Waking up beside you, he said. Coming in at dusk to your voice on the porch. Sharing food we both helped grow. And when the hard years come, and they will facing them together. She nodded once. That's what I want too. Xavier didn't rush the moment. He waited until her gaze met his fully, and then he leaned in and kissed her, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that doesn't ask a question but answers one. By dusk, the still room was swept and shelved, a fire laid in the small stove she'd built from salvaged brick. Brielle placed a tin of dried sage on the sill and watched as the last light of day lit the green door she'd painted that morning. Inside the cabin, Xavier was setting 2 plates on the table, the scent of cornbread and beans drifting into the yard. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The latch clicked soft, like a promise. By early May, the wildflowers had begun to crest along the hill's Indian paintbrush and bluebonnet tangled under the post oaks, painting soft color through the rugged earth. The warmth had settled in for good, and with it came the kind of quiet that only arrives when the last hard thing has passed. Brielle stepped out of the still room, her hands dusted with dried lavender and beeswax, apron tucked around her waist. She looked toward the pasture where Xavier knelt beside a new post, hammering it into place with a calm, methodical rhythm. The fence would stretch another 40 feet by the time he was done, not because they needed it yet, but because he'd taken to building for the future like a man who finally believed they had won. She crossed the yard, the hem of her skirt brushing soft against her boots. I had a letter, she said once she reached him, holding out the folded paper. From the woman who took over the Zanders place east of Austin. She heard I was here. Xavier leaned back on his heels, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. She wants something from you. She wants to buy salves for her midwife kit. Said she heard from the preacher's wife in Llano that I might have a steady hand. He took the letter, read it once, then looked up at her. You going to send her something? I already packed it, she said, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. Chamomile, comfrey, and a touch of golden seal. Xavier stood, brushing sawdust from his trousers. You're turning into someone the county counts on. Brielle set her hands on her hips. Feels strange, being needed in a way that doesn't take something from me. He studied her a moment, eyes soft under the brim of his hat. You've got a way of giving that don't ask anything back. That's rare. She scoffed lightly, but not without warmth. You're the one who taught me what it looks like. That night, they sat on the porch, the lantern hung low behind them, casting a pale ring of light across the cedar planks. The stars stretched wide overhead, untouched by cloud or smoke. Brielle leaned against Xavier's side, her head tucked just beneath his shoulder. He ran a thumb along the edge of her hand. I've been thinking we could add a room to the cabin. What for? She asked, voice quiet. For what's coming, he said. If we're going to raise children here, we'll need space. She turned her face to him, a slow smile rising. You're sure? I've spent most of my life not knowing what I was meant for. He looked at her, his voice even. But I know now. I'm meant to be here with you, building this life, raising what we grow together. She took his hand and pressed it to her chest. I want that, Xavier. I want it all. The planting, the hard seasons, the joy that comes in between. I want to grow old with you. He leaned down and kissed her gently, not with urgency, but with deep and certain care, the kind that settles into a man's bones and stays there. The next morning, they rode to the courthouse in Llano, where the clerk wore an old coat 2 sizes too big and the ink on the marriage certificate smudged slightly at the corner. But they didn't mind. Brielle wore a dress dyed with walnut and stitched by her own hand. Xavier had trimmed his beard and polished his boots until the leather shone. They said their vows with no audience but the clerk and a couple waiting for their own papers. Still, when Xavier took her hand, the whole room felt hushed. He said her name like it was the first and last good thing he'd ever known. They rode home under a sky streaked gold with dust. When they reached the ridge, the wind picked up enough to lift the edge of her shawl, and she turned in the saddle. Let's build that room, she said. We'll need it before long. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. We'll build whatever you need. Seasons turned. The stillroom shelves filled with jars labeled in Brielle's careful script. Folks came on horseback and wagon, asking for help with coughs, burns, birthing pains. She never turned anyone away. Xavier repaired barns and broke horses, but he always came home by nightfall, boots dusty and arms open. The new room was ready by the time the baby came, a girl with a quiet, steady gaze and her father's hands. They named her Lark, and she grew in the rhythm of the land, cradled by the wind that moved through the grass and the sound of her mother's voice at dusk. Years passed, stitched with small joys, the smell of summer rain, the creak of the porch swing beneath weary bodies, the hush of winter mornings when the world slept sound. Brielle and Xavier aged with grace, their love deepening not through grand declarations, but through shared silence and the quiet acts of care that shaped every hour. And when the time came to pass down the still room and the land, it was Lark who took the reins, her father's steadiness in her spine and her mother's fire in her eyes. On the final evening of their last hard day, Brielle and Xavier sat beneath the same porch where they'd once spoken of green doors and shared futures. The air was warm, the sky endless. I never thought I'd get all this, she whispered. Xavier took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. You didn't get it, he said softly. You built it. And together, they watched the sun set over the land they'd made their own, wrapped in a peace that had been earned, not given. A love that had grown sure, like the roots of a tree that had weathered every storm and still stood tall.